close your eyes now and let your breath find a slow, steady rhythm, like the gentle lapping of waves against an ancient shore. We are going to take a journey back through the mists of time, drifting across the centuries to a land of olive groves and high, rugged mountains where history was carved into the very stone. Imagine the warm sun of the Mediterranean touching your skin, a golden light that has bathed the valleys of Greece for thousands of years. We find ourselves in the Peloponnese, a place of stark beauty and profound silence, where the wind whispers stories of a city that once prided itself on being unlike any other. This is the story of Sparta, not told with the clash of steel or the roar of battle, but through the quiet, enduring shadows of those who lived within its rigid walls. We look back not to judge with the sharpness of the waking mind, but to observe with the calm detachment of a dream, understanding how the lives of women, captured and brought to this strange land, were woven into the complex tapestry of a society obsessed with order. The world of antiquity was a place of cycles, where cities rose and fell like the tides, and the fate of a person was often decided by the turning of a wheel they could not control. For a woman in a conquered city, the end of a siege marked a profound transition, a movement from the known into the unknown. Imagine the silence that settles over a city after the conflict is past. A heavy, dust-mote-filled quiet where the only sound is the wind moving through empty courtyards. It was in these moments that the Spartan officers would arrive, not merely as conquerors, but as assessors of a new order. They moved with a terrifying calm, viewing the population not as enemies to be vanquished in anger, but as resources to be cataloged. For the women standing in the ruins of their former lives, holding their children close, this was the beginning of a long 2020. Strange journey into a life defined by the needs of the state. A life where their previous names and titles would slowly dissolve into the dry air of the Eurotas Valley. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, violet shadows across the broken walls, the separation would begin. It was not a chaotic frenzy, but a methodical restructuring of reality. The Spartan system was built on the belief that the state was the only family that mattered. And so, the bonds of blood were often severed to serve the greater design. Women were marched away from their homes, leaving behind the echoes of their past, walking toward a future that was as disciplined and unyielding as the mountains that surrounded their new home. They walked in lines, hundreds of them, their footsteps soft on the earth, carrying the weight of their memories into a new existence where they would become the silent engines of a warrior society. And as the stars began to appear in the vast, velvet sky above, one might wonder what thoughts occupied their minds as they moved further away from everything they had ever known. To truly understand the world these women were entering, we must first gently explore the nature of Sparta itself, a society that viewed itself as a masterpiece of human engineering, while other cities in Greece, like Athens, were busy debating philosophy in the marketplace and building marble temples to beauty. Sparta was turning inward, focusing all its energy on a singular purpose: stability. It was a society that had stripped away the softness of life, believing that comfort was a danger and that individual desire was a threat to the whole. They called their way of life the agoge, a system of upbringing that was less about education and more about molding human beings into identical, unbreakable bricks in a wall of flesh. It was a world of immense discipline, where the cry of a newborn baby was not a cause for celebration, but the start of a rigorous inspection, a test to see if the child was strong enough to bear the burden of being a Spartan. At the foundation of this silent, austere society lay the Helots, a vast population of people who had been conquered long ago and were now bound to the land. Imagine the fields of Messenia, stretching out green and fertile under the sun, worked by thousands of hands that did not own the soil they tilled. The Spartans were the masters, few in number, living in a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, always aware that they were outnumbered by those they ruled. This fear was the heartbeat of Sparta. It drove their obsession with strength, their rejection of luxury, and their ruthless control over every aspect of life. For the Spartans, maintaining this balance was a divine duty, a fragile order that had to be protected at all costs. And to protect it, they believed they needed to control not just the land and the weapons, but the very flow of life itself, the bloodlines, the families, and the future generations. This is where the captured women entered the story, becoming a vital part of Sparta's strategy to maintain its dominance. They were not merely prisoners of war, they were seen as biological assets, vessels that could be used to reshape the demographics of the state. The Spartans understood that a culture survives through its mothers, through the stories whispered to children at night, through the language spoken at the hearth. To truly conquer a rival, they believed they had to interrupt this transmission of culture. And so, the women taken from defeated cities were brought into the Spartan fold not to be integrated, but to be absorbed. Their identities slowly erased and replaced by the unyielding demands of the state. It was a quiet, slow-moving tragedy, a reshaping of the soul that took place behind the closed doors of simple, austere households. Imagine arriving in the valley of Sparta, where the river Eurotas flows cool and steady between the reeds. The landscape is beautiful, framed by the towering, snow-capped peaks of Mount Taygetus. But for the captive women, this beauty was a cage. The air here smelled of pine and dust, and the atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken pressure. The women were sorted, much like the grain at harvest, their fates decided by their age, their health, and their social standing. For the women of the elite, the wives of generals, the daughters of politicians from the conquered cities, a specific, calculated destiny awaited. Sparta did not want them to remain as symbols of a fallen nobility. Instead, they were to be repurposed to serve the very men who had defeated their husbands and fathers. This was the practice of forced marriage, though the word marriage implies a union of choice that did not exist here. These women, who days before had worn the fine linens of their own city's aristocracy, were now dressed in the simple, rough wool of Sparta. They were assigned to Spartan citizens, perhaps older men who had lost their wives, or warriors who had not yet produced an heir. The ceremony was a public statement of dominance. Picture a woman standing before a man she does not know, a man who represents the destruction of her world, and being told that she is now his. It was a psychological dismantling, a way for Sparta to say to the world that nothing could stand against it, that even the most sacred bonds of its enemies could be rewritten by Spartan law. Once inside the Spartan household, the real work of erasure began. These women were expected to manage the domestic sphere, to oversee the helot servants, and, most importantly, to bear children. But these children would not belong to the mother's lineage. They would belong to the state. The mother was expected to raise her son to be a Spartan warrior, to teach him the values of austerity, obedience, and martial prowess, the very values that had led to the ruin of her own people. It was a profound internal conflict, a silent war waged in the heart of every mother who looked into the eyes of her child and saw both her own flesh and the face of her captor. How does one navigate such a life? Finding moments of quiet resistance or simple survival in the daily routine of a world designed to strip you of your selfhood. Beyond the forced marriages of the elite, there was a broader, more systematic approach to reproduction that the Spartans employed. They were a people obsessed with eugenics, though they would not have used that word. They believed that strength could be bred, like one breeds horses or hounds. For the captured women who were deemed physically robust, tall, and strong, there was often no pretense of marriage. They were assigned as breeding partners, a term that feels cold and mechanical because the process was exactly that. A Spartan man might be encouraged to have a child with a captive woman if it was believed the offspring would possess superior physical traits. The emotional world of the woman was irrelevant to the state. Only the biological outcome mattered. In these arrangements, the human element was suppressed in favor of the collective goal. A woman might bear a child who would be taken from her at the age of 7 to enter the agoge, the brutal training camps of the Spartan military. She would watch him go, knowing that the boy she nursed would be hardened into a weapon, taught to suppress his own empathy, just as the state had suppressed her freedom. There were also children born of unions between captured women and helots, children who would inherit the status of slavery, destined to work the land forever. For the mothers, this was perhaps the deepest sorrow, to bring life into a world that promised only servitude. To know that the cycle of bondage would continue with their own flesh and blood. Yet, even in this system of rigid control, the human spirit has a way of seeking connection. We can imagine that in the quiet moments, perhaps while weaving wool by the fire or walking to the river to wash clothes, these women found ways to whisper their true names to their children. Perhaps they told stories of their old cities, of gods that Sparta did not worship, of a time when they were free. These small acts of memory were invisible rebellions, tiny sparks of light in a gray world. They could not overthrow the Spartan state, but they could preserve a fragment of the soul, a secret garden of identity that the state could not touch. It forces us to ask, is a culture ever truly erased as long as one person remembers the old songs? For the majority of women captured by Spartan forces, the destination was not a Spartan household, but the life of a helot. The helots were the backbone of Spartan society, the vast, silent majority who produced the food, the wine, and the oil that kept the warrior class alive. To become a helot was to enter a state of permanent, hereditary servitude. A woman who had once been a weaver, a baker, or a farmer's wife in a free city would find herself bound to the soil, tethered to the rhythms of the earth, serving a master who viewed the world only through the lens of order and discipline. Her days would be filled with grinding labor, planting in the spring rains, harvesting under the baking summer sun. pressing olives until her hands were stained and calloused. The life of a Helot woman was defined by vulnerability. She had no legal standing, no right to refuse a command, no protection against the whims of the Spartan citizens. She lived in a community of other slaves, families who had been in bondage for generations, people who carried the memory of their lost freedom like a heavy stone in their chests. For a newly captured woman, the transition was jarring. She had to learn the rules of survival in a system designed to keep her head bowed. She had to learn to be invisible, to work without complaint, to hide her grief behind a mask of obedience. And yet, there was a shared strength in the Helot communities, a solidarity born of shared suffering. They lived in the shadow of the mountains, raising their families in simple huts, finding moments of solace in the rituals of the seasons. But there was always a dark cloud hanging over them, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. The Spartans ruled through fear, and they were not afraid to use it. The Helot women knew that their children were never truly safe, that at any moment, the state could intervene in their lives with brutal finality. It was a life lived on the edge of a precipice, where the ground could crumble away at any moment. And still, they persisted. They woke up every morning. They baked bread. They cared for their young, and they endured. The most terrifying manifestation of Spartan control was a secret institution known as the crypteia. It is a word that whispers of darkness and hidden things. This was a rite of passage for the young Spartan men. The elite graduates of the military academy, they were sent out into the countryside, armed only with daggers and their cunning, with a mandate to police the Helot population. But police is too gentle a word. Their mission was to cull the herd, to remove any Helot who showed too much strength, too much intelligence, or too much leadership potential. For the Helot women, the crypteia was the shadow in the valley, the rustle in the bushes at twilight that made the heart stop. Imagine the psychological toll of living in a world where the state actively hunts the best and brightest of your people. A mother would look at her son, growing tall and strong, and feel not pride, but a cold dread. She would teach him to stoop, to speak simply, to hide his light under a bushel, because to shine was to invite death. The crypteia did not need a reason to strike. Their purpose was to maintain the atmosphere of terror that kept the massive slave population in check. It was a form of psychological warfare waged on a daily basis, a reminder that the Spartans held the power of life and death in their hands. This constant threat shaped the way captured women raised their families. They had to be protectors, teachers of survival, and keepers of secrets. They had to instill in their children a dual consciousness, an outward appearance of submission, and an inner core of resilience. It was a high-wire act of parenting, performed in the shadow of a spear. The silence of the Spartan countryside was not a peaceful silence. It was a silence born of caution, a holding of breath that lasted for centuries. And yet, beneath that silence, the memory of freedom flowed like an underground river, unseen but powerful, waiting for the earth to crack. But history teaches us that systems built on rigidity and fear are inherently brittle. Sparta, for all its projected strength, was slowly dying from the inside. The very practices that made them formidable, the eugenics, the constant warfare, The brutal suppression of the Helots were also the seeds of their destruction. The population of full Spartan citizens began to dwindle. A phenomenon known as oliganthropia. They were breeding themselves out of existence, their gene pool narrowing, their numbers falling with every battle, every earthquake, every refusal to adapt. The machine was running out of parts. The turning point came in the year 371 B.C. On the plains of Leuctra, the Theban army, led by a brilliant general who refused to play by Spartan rules, shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. For the captured women and the Helots, this was a moment of earth-shattering change. The defeat of the Spartan army meant the loosening of the iron grip. When the Thebans marched into the Peloponnese, they did something unthinkable. They liberated Messenia. After centuries of enslavement, the Helots were free. The women who had lived their lives in the shadow of the Cryptaea, who had raised children to be invisible, suddenly found themselves standing in the light of a new day. The collapse of Spartan power was swift. Without the labor of the Helots, the Spartan economy crumbled. The warrior class, so long supported by the suffering of others, found themselves unable to maintain their way of life. The women who had been forced into marriages, who had been treated as breeding stock, watched as the society that had enslaved them fell into ruin. It was a slow, grinding justice. The grand experiment of Sparta, which had sacrificed everything human on the altar of perfection, ended not in glory, but in irrelevance. The city became a museum of its own past, a curiosity for tourists from Rome, while the descendants of the women they had captured built new lives on the land that was finally their own. As we drift back from the ancient world, leaving the ruins of Sparta to the wind and the wildflowers, what are we left with? We see a civilization that achieved military greatness but lost its soul in the process. We see the faces of the women, the captives, the mothers, the Helots who bore the weight of that civilization on their backs. Their names were largely unrecorded by the historians of the time, who were more interested in battles and kings. But their experience is the true texture of history. It serves as a somber reminder that the structures of power, no matter how imposing they seem, are often fragile. The Spartans tried to engineer a perfect society by controlling nature, by controlling reproduction, by controlling the human spirit. But in the end, the human spirit proved more durable than their laws. The women who survived, who adapted, who whispered stories in the dark, were the ones who carried the thread of life forward when the Spartan line broke. So, as you settle deeper into the comfort of your bed, let the story of Sparta fade into the night. Let the anxiety of their rigid order dissolve, replaced by the comforting knowledge that time eventually levels all walls. The voices of the past are not there to haunt us, but to remind us of the resilience that lives within us all. The wind still blows through the Eurotas Valley, rustling the olive leaves, a gentle, eternal sound that has outlasted the march of armies.